Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and joining me on the show is Chad Israelson, who has written a book, Kings of the North, about Minnesota Vikings history, a tremendous book. And so we bring on Chad to talk Vikings history with the passing of the great Jim Marshall. And also, Chad has another book coming out very soon on quarterbacks, which seems like we could probably connect to what's going on today. So welcome back to the show, Chad. Great to have you. I really don't want to only have you on the show when someone awesome passes away for the Vikings, but you give such incredible perspective. I want you to give me your reaction to the passing of Jim Marshall, and let's just start the conversation with, to you as a Vikings historian, what he means in Vikings history.
Sure. Well, first, thank you very much, Matthew, for having me back. Really appreciate that. Yeah, obviously, I've been thinking about Jim Marshall, for the past 24 hours or so, and I really thought that, if you were to distill everything about the Minnesota Vikings down into one player, that basic element would be Jim Marshall. If the aliens came from outer space and, they wanted to know about the Vikings, you would start with Jim Marshall. That would be the basic building block. He had the good fortune of timing. He came to the Vikings in 1961, and it's really quite amazing. But I was thinking about it too, that it was 1980 before the franchise played a game that didn't include Jim Marshall. That's 270 consecutive starts, regular season, 19 more in the playoffs. And watching the tributes, I saw the raw footage from Chuck Foreman's Fox 9 interview yesterday. It's about 15 minutes long. Just all the things that he had to say. I mean, it was basically the same thing that I'm saying right now about Marshall. Obviously, he knew him personally, but you look at the old things, that Bud Grant had said. I just watched something that Fran Tarkington put up today. And your article in Purple Insider, I mean, that hit the nail on the head too. And that was perfect. I mean, Jim Marshall, his toughness, his leadership, Captain Jim, the only player in Vikings history to ever wear number 70. They didn't officially retire it until like 99, but no one else wore it in that time. So yeah, Jim Marshall is the Minnesota Vikings.
And one thing that kept coming up over and over again that I noticed in watching the tributes too, and Fran Tarkenton said this, and I took from some old NFL Films interviews with Bud Grant, is the word special when it came to Jim Marshall. Now, I have no idea how a man that played in that era could play every single game. I mean, we think about how tough it is now, and these guys have cryo chambers, and they have all the sports science through the roof. That was not something Jim Marshall had. Oh yeah, by the way, if you just wanted to punch someone after the play, you probably wouldn't even get thrown out of the game for doing it. I mean, the violence of the game, and yet he was able to be on the field. But what really stood out to me is the way that Bud Grant talked about him. There was one quote that really popped to me. He said, "I call him Mr. Marshall." I mean, the reverence that he had, that Bud Grant had, and we're talking about Bud as one of the greatest coaches in NFL history, and this was really his sergeant. Like, this was his right-hand man. And I think that when we have those conversations about the Hall of Fame, which we'll get into, of course, when it comes to Jim Marshall, sure, sacks that Pro Football Reference has now tracked show that he had a lot of impact on those great defenses and everything else, but it is really truly unquantifiable what he meant to Bud Grant in terms of being in command of that football team.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely it. First and foremost, if Bud Grant says it, I believe it. So, I just start right there. But yeah, absolutely. And when you were talking about the conditions, and keeping in mind there were no bye weeks when Marshall played, and by December, Met Stadium was like playing in a parking lot darn near, or slop, depending on how warm it got that day. But yeah, you had none of the niceties that they have today in order to play. And as you mentioned, the violence of the game. I just recently watched opening NFL Today, and half of the plays on there would be illegal now, horse collar tackles and, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, Marshall played in a tough time. He was, as I mentioned before, Captain Jim, and Bud Grant said the smartest thing I ever did was make him captain when I came in 1967. And, testament to Bud Grant to be able to recognize that so quickly, and, they, like Chuck Foreman was talking about yesterday, if Jim Marshall said, we're going to go, we're going to go. If Bud told him to take a lap, he took it, and everyone else followed Jim Marshall. So, yeah, I mean, when one of your best players is able to not only perform on the field to that level, stay on the field with that consistency, but also exude that type of leadership. I mean, you've got a good squad, and obviously they had some excellent teams in his era.
Well, and it's almost hard to define how good they were by today's terms, because I don't know that people could imagine a football team allowing less than 10 points a game for an entire season on defense. And it's always been said to me in Vikings history, and there's a lot of that, where if only this one other thing, or if only Fran Tarkenton had not been a New York Giant when the Vikings in, I think it was 71, were allowing 9.9 points per game, and they did not have the quarterback play to match up in the playoffs. But in the regular season, the most dominating defense probably of all time. And had they won the Super Bowl, they would have been the one that everyone references instead of the 85 Bears, probably. Well, it's not the 71 Vikings and that defensive line. And I think with Marshall, that he does get lost a little bit in Carl Eller and Alan Page. To me, it speaks to his greatness that everyone looked to Jim Marshall when those other guys were on the team, along with Paul Krause. I mean, you're talking about some of the greatest players of all time. And I was looking up the All-Pros and the Pro Bowls, because this has always been a bit of a knock against Jim Marshall that he didn't get those things. And there's a year where, once Pro Football Reference went back and tracked all the sacks, where Jim Marshall has more sacks than Carl Eller, but Carl Eller is first team All-Pro and Pro Bowl and all those things. And that's no knock on Eller, but it's just that I don't think that there was a good way to evaluate the players outside of, well, this guy has the reputation. And when two guys already had the reputation as being their great players and not as much Marshall, they got rewarded with things like that when they weren't going to give all the All-Pros to all Minnesota Vikings defensive linemen. And I feel like he just kind of got left out of that party with some of the awards unfairly.
Yeah. Well, I think you're exactly right. Again, to reference your article, I was thinking something similar to that. I figured we'd be talking about, Marshall and Hall of Fame at some point today. So, no, I completely buy that line of thinking. I remember reading a newspaper article by Barrero, I think, in the late 80s. And he was just talking about the locker room, and they were, because the players vote, on the Pro Bowl as well. And one of the guys in the locker room, he didn't say who it was, but he just shouted out, what kind of season is, I'll just say, Jackie Slater having? What he didn't know any more than, anybody else. Like, just, well, that's a name, and we'll put him in. So, yeah, and I think it ultimately boils down to your point of the fact that, yeah, 3 Minnesota Vikings. I mean, Page and Eller were incredibly dominant players. And that does not take away from Jim Marshall's greatness. It's not an either or type of thing or a zero-sum game. All 3 of these men were great football players. And so for a long time, I've been peeved by the fact that Jim Marshall is not in the Hall of Fame. Whether it's the opponent fumble recovery record, the consecutive game record, he, to me, is probably the greatest player not in the Hall of Fame right now. And I don't have any axe to grind with, some of the recent guys from like the 70s when I grew up. I mean, not that I was breaking down film then or anything. And I know Randy Gradishar was a great linebacker. I know Elvin Bethea was a great defensive end for the Houston Oilers. Were they better than Jim Marshall? I have a hard time believing that. Were they on par with him? Sure, I'd accept that argument. But, so, yeah, that's just it. I mean, Jim Marshall, in his absolute talent to me, is one of the underappreciated stories in the NFL.
Well, and now that we have these numbers, to me, as soon as those stats came out from Pro Football Reference, which I consider to be credible with all the work that they put into finding those numbers, the top 11 players of all time in sacks are all in the Hall of Fame. And some of the ones just behind them are on their way. And Marshall is 15th, which I know took place over many years. But even when I looked at his peak performance for sack seasons, he was in the top 5 in the NFL from 62 to 69, which were his best seasons as a defender in terms of sack production. And the other players ahead of him, one guy ahead and one guy behind, are both in the Hall of Fame. And that's what I think was probably hard for voters for a very long time, was what do we go back and really look at statistically when we don't have sacks? But now that we do, I think it shines a light on just how impactful Marshall was, plus not to mention how much game planning goes into it for other teams and how are they going to face off against him, often facing the best tackles on the team, things like that. And I just think when you have these dynastic type of teams, and I know without a Super Bowl, we can't call them a dynasty, but the defense kind of was, somebody always gets left out of the party. I mean, one, because I grew up in Buffalo, was their center, Kent Hall, who I considered to be one of the best players of all time. But they put in the quarterback, the running back, the wide receiver. There's probably not another guy who's going to go in. And I think that's what happened to Marshall. But, you know, you said that you think he's probably the best player not in the Hall of Fame. I 100% agree with you. And I was thinking about this just in my article about how we can't let that define his legacy, that he's just not in the Hall of Fame. Because if you're here and if you know, and if you followed this franchise from its beginning, or you followed its history because you like old NFL films or whatever else, I think that it shouldn't matter that much to you, because the people that saw Jim Marshall play and the people that played with him and the people that coached him and the people that rooted for him know how great he was. And some Hall of Fame voter in Indianapolis or Cincinnati or Jacksonville, there's nothing you can do to control that, I think. I know that it's an injustice because he belongs in, but I also think that it's not a tarnishing of his legacy that other people decided that he wasn't as valuable as everyone here knows he was.
Right. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, anybody that follows the Vikings, knows about Jim Marshall. To me, the greatest testament is what the guys who played with him said about him. And so, again, as a Viking fan and as a person that, is into Vikings history, there's just no question to me that he's on that Mount Rushmore of Minnesota Vikings, and he's kind of as I said earlier, the starting point. So yeah, I 100% agree that should not be his legacy. And the sad thing is it often happens is then they elect people after they've passed away. I think Viking fans can certainly have a little bit of a grudge here, thinking how long it took Tingelhoff to get in, how long it took Kraus, the all-time interception leader. Fran Tarkenton didn't make it in until his third go around, and he held every major passing record when he retired. So, I think, overall the Vikings have been underappreciated by the national media, sports writers, because of that lack of a Super Bowl, which really is, if you've been to 4, you were really good. So.
Well, and I don't want to make Jim Marshall's passing about me ranting about how he should be in the Hall of Fame. I think that's what I'm kind of getting at, is we here can celebrate Jim Marshall's legacy, and the Minnesota Vikings are not, I think Bud said this, or maybe Fran Tarkenton, like, they're just not who they are without Jim Marshall. And when Fran Tarkenton, one of the great quarterbacks in history, says the heart and soul of this football team was Jim Marshall, to me, that carries a lot more weight than people who didn't cover him, who are looking back at Pro Bowls and things like that. So I don't want to make it a rant every time, but it's almost hard not to, because it is so much part of his legacy that he has been underappreciated and not fully celebrated by the Pro Football Hall of Fame. The other thing that, again, I try not to turn into some sort of grudge is about the play, the wrong way run. And it is one of the strangest most shocking bloopers to ever watch. All of us, I'm sure, when you saw it for the first time, I think I saw it watching NFL films as a kid, and I asked my dad about it, like, how did he run the wrong way? And it's a funny blooper. It's no different than any other strange thing. Somebody tries to dunk a ball and it bounces, 100 feet in the air, or Jose Canseco having a ball bounce off his head for a home run. But what I don't understand about this one is how it seemed to be made into more than what it was, which was just a really bad, weird mistake that I'm sure if you've ever strapped a football helmet on and you've run around out there, being disoriented on a football field, it's not that hard. It's just a crazy mistake that happened. They won the football game. They won it on a play that Jim Marshall made. And that's how it should have been left. And yet every single feature about Jim Marshall has to be like, oh yeah, this was the guy that ran the wrong way. And I think that it became a little bit of who he was outside of here. Oh yeah, that's the guy who ran the wrong way, as opposed to, hey, that's just a really weird thing that happened one time in a football game.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple of things about it. One, it is unique. If 5 or 6 other guys would have done it over the years, then, maybe it wouldn't, we wouldn't hear about it so much. But, when I was working out in the yard today and thinking about this, it kind of occurred to me that, so that takes place in 1964. And so, that's Eller's rookie year. Page isn't there yet. So I don't know who was actually in the game at that moment. But keep in mind, that was a pass play. So Jim Marshall is 12, 15 yards downfield to pick up the fumble as a defensive end. I don't know where the other 3 guys were on the defensive line because the camera, we didn't have 1,000 cameras for each game back then, but I know where they weren't, and that was at the ball. So, the fact that we remember Jim Marshall for this, I mean, maybe we should remember him for hustling his butt off and getting to that point to be able to pick that fumble up, So, I mean, to me, that's the essence of who he was. A guy that busted his butt every practice, every game, and that's what, again, the tributes have been saying. He didn't miss a practice. He was there all the time. I mean, he got out of the hospital and came and played a game. I certainly recognize why, people might be amused by that play and that sort of thing. But, I think that there's more to the story than just the fact that he ran the wrong way with the ball. And as you also pointed out, they won, and they won because of what he did in that game. Another thing I was thinking about him today, too, was, when Brett Favre broke his record, and which, no great joy to me as a Vikings fan. And I know Brett Favre was on the Vikings at that time, but, I was kind of hoping that some point for the Packers along the way, Favre wouldn't be the guy to do it, but kudos to him. I mean, that's a heck of a thing to do. But, Marshall came and congratulated Favre at practice. He wasn't able to make the actual game, but he came the following week then as well. And, I just think about Favre's interaction with, say, Mark Gastineau in a record that we've all seen. And, that says something about Jim Marshall. Jim Marshall was happy for Brett Favre to break that record. So as a human being, as a football player, this is a great guy. And, again, everyone is saying that. I mean, if it weren't so universal, and if it wasn't before he passed and after he passed, I might question it a little bit. But this has been all I've ever heard about Jim Marshall, was how great he was.
Yeah, certainly. And he also was active in the community as well with his foundation, which in 2020, the Vikings Social Justice Committee, which is formed by current players, gave $20,000 to his foundation. So I think that also shows you that he stayed here, cared about the community, was a part of it, wanted to be a part of it, which, in Minnesota matters to us a lot when guys stick around. Alan Page, the same thing. I'm sure you could still see him jogging around a lake somewhere in Minnesota. So Marshall being the same kind of way was meaningful. But we only talk about that one play. I'm curious to hear from you about other teams' moments that Jim Marshall was a part of, because I think that a lot of excellence gets left in the dust. And I showed my favorite play, and most of my knowledge of what happened in the 70s is just my love for NFL films. And I've seen there's a play where Marshall laterals to Alan Page, runs for a touchdown against the Lions in the snow, in the mud. So the perfect definition of the teamwork of that defensive line. I love that play, and I love the NFL Films music behind it. I'm just curious about, from you, when you think about Jim Marshall and plays that are not the one blooper, what come to mind?
Well, first, I just want to say the one picture that comes to mind, I saw it on the back page of the Minnesota Star Tribune, and I'm pretty sure it is from that game against Detroit, 1969, Thanksgiving Day, but it's that profile of Marshall, all muddy, in the snow. Again, like, to me, that's it. That if there's a picture that is worth 1,000 words, that's it for Marshall. Actually, one of the things I remember the most as a young person was it was actually that, and you see a lot of it on NFL Films or, over the past day or so, his last game at Met Stadium. I know you referenced the thanks, Jim, but he actually came out. The Vikings had the ball. They were beating the Bills 10-3, and he came out and he played offensive line for the kneel down. And just, the crowd reaction. I remember watching that as a kid over at my friend's house, and his dad was, "Oh, look at that! Look what they're doing!" It was just a really exciting kind of thing. Understanding, like, wow, as a 10-year-old, whatever, this defensive end's playing offensive line for this. This must be really special. So that's one thing. The play that you mentioned in Detroit, of course, I wasn't alive for that one either, but I've seen it many times. And to me, it also just highlights what tremendous athletes the Purple People Eaters were. That's a great no-look pass, that Marshall whips to Page. There's a great clip of him, just making one of those, and it's against the Packers. I'm trying to remember if Starr was still quarterbacking or if it was, just right after Bart Starr. But, where he just leaps on the quarterback's back, engulfing the entirety of the Packers quarterback. That one always stands out in my mind. And it's also just amazing to me that, by the end of the season, they said that guys like Page and Marshall were down in like the 220s for weight, which, you can't even fathom that today. I think counting on him day in and day out, like, by the time I was watching the Vikings, of course, he was getting to the end of his career. He didn't block the kicks in the same way that Eller and Page did, a little bit smaller a stature than, say, Eller, for example. But it was just kind of the, knowing that he was the Iron Man and knowing that he was there every game, and, just really thinking that he was indestructible. Just, again, phenomenal talent.
Well, and that speaks to another thing about the Hall of Fame. And again, I don't mean to keep going back to it, but if availability is the best ability, this is the most available player in the history of the NFL, and playing that position in that era is just an unbelievable feat that you can guarantee on the defensive side of the ball. No player is ever going to, not a defensive lineman, is ever going to match this ever again from Jim Marshall. Just one more thing, and then I want to get into the quarterbacks a little bit with you, Chad. Marshall was a fascinating dude. I mean, in the NFL Films feature, he's quoting Teddy Roosevelt. He's jumping out of a plane. He is somewhere snowy with a bunch of husky dogs doing, what is that, sledding, whatever, dog sledding. I mean, he is such an interesting guy. And I think that very much about Alan Page, of course, Justice Page, and how intellectual that defensive line was to go along with their physical talent. But he was also a bit of a daredevil. I have heard that his drives back from Mankato were famous, that he had set the world record for the fastest anyone got from Mankato back to Minneapolis. I think his off-field stuff is almost as incredible as his on-field stuff. He had a bunch of run-ins with near death. I mean, just a super interesting guy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just fascinating to me. I mean, everything that you said, I would echo that. I remember for a long time, reading about those races that they would have back from Mankato, and he was the one that fired the gun to start it. And Royce's article today, kind of like, don't ask what kind of gun it was, so probably not the same kind of thing you would see today. It was a little wilder time. My uncle, my family on my mom's side is from that general area, and he used to talk about going to the Albatross and seeing the guys there during training camp, and full pitchers of beer, for example. But he's a brilliant guy. That came up in Chuck Foreman's interview. I've seen it in other interviews. We know about the hang gliding accident. You were talking about the dog sledding. I mean, to be that multifaceted is really an impressive thing. And when you were asking me in the previous question too, just something popped in my head. But when talking about specific plays and that kind of thing, this is more overall about Marshall. But he was a little bit undersized as a defensive end. Obviously, we talk about that. So his game is going to be quickness. He played until he was 41 years old, relying on that quickness. So just in terms, again, of his athletic ability, I mean, to me, that's phenomenal. Most speed rushers are burned out by mid-30s, and they get pushed around then because they don't have the size. But Marshall was contributing into his 40s playing that type of game. So off the field, on the field, what a guy.
Well, and I always think about him just in my mind, other than that play on Thanksgiving in the snow, I just think of him knifing into the backfield, like cutting inside the tackle, in between the tackle and guard, and just he's there. And the handoff is getting to the running back's hands as Jim Marshall is arriving to take him down. And I can only wonder how many tackles for loss Jim Marshall had that would have even bolstered the statistical case. But nonetheless, one of the 5 or 6 guys that you would start the conversation with about the Minnesota Vikings and their history, his connection with Bud Grant. I do not think that they go to those Super Bowls without him, or that their legacy is the same without Jim Marshall. So an incredible life lived by him. You are working on a new project, which should be quite a journey for you through Vikings quarterback history. And what's so fascinating about the quarterback history, Chad, is that we've arrived at a point where the motif of the Vikings finding random quarterbacks, making them great, even up until last year with Sam Darnold, it actually has a chance to end. So I wonder, just in your mind, like how, as you've been researching this project and writing about Vikings quarterbacks through history, like what are you thinking now as we're almost, it feels like on the edge of something with JJ McCarthy that this franchise has flirted with a few times? Dante Culpepper, Teddy Bridgewater, Tommy Kramer, all guys that they drafted and never quite got there to the decade-long franchise quarterback, as they now have the highest pick in history at the quarterback position in JJ McCarthy.
Well, I'm both optimistic, cautiously, and very excited, very full of hope. I mean, I am looking at JJ McCarthy and, penciling him in as a 15-year starter. I mean, like this should be it. You've been watching him, so obviously you've seen more than I have so far. But he seems to have all the tools. He seems to have the mindset. He's obviously got the coaching. So he's got the talent around him. An offensive line has been rebuilt. Like the arrow is pointing the right way, more so than I've seen it in a long, long time. I mean, maybe those late 80s era Vikings, but still not at quarterback. That was going to be more of a game manager like Wade Wilson and a great defense around him. McCarthy is going to have the ability to make plays. So he's a step certainly above that. You talk about like the 1 year wonders. We've had like the stars. Brett Favre for a year, Randall Cunningham. They played for more than 1 year, but they only had one really great year. Then the Keenums that come out of nowhere, and Sam Bradford. Oh, he had a pretty decent year, and that could have been something. That's basically the next sentence. Well, that could have been something. Now I think, I really think the Vikings have something. And again, as a Viking fan, I know anyone that's watching this, in the back of their minds, just like mine, it's like, okay, what's going to go wrong? We were talking about that sort of mentality a little bit, prior to going on air here, but you can't help but have that as a Viking fan. But I don't believe in curses. I don't believe in voodoo. I think JJ McCarthy is the real deal, and we are going to have a very enjoyable decade and a half as Viking fans.
And that is your cautious optimism version, which is a decade and a half of him as a starter. Well, we'll get to mini camp next week, so we'll take it from there. But I want to know who your favorite quarterback to research was. Not the best necessarily in Vikings history, but who you enjoyed as you were going through, learning more about their story, getting the details of them as a quarterback. I think I have an answer of my own, but I'm very curious about yours.
Yeah, well, so that's a great question. It's kind of tough because there's adult me and young me, right? As I'm writing this, so I the way I look at Kramer or even Steve Dills for that matter is different than how I'm looking at Dante Culpepper, or any of the guys in my adult life. One of my favorites, both as a, kind of as I watched him, and then as I researched him a little bit, I really like Brad Johnson, in part because, I always had in my head, oh, he was a really good crunch time quarterback. And then when I looked up, in fact, he was, like in 97, I think he threw the most fourth quarter touchdowns in the NFL. He had the best passer rating in the fourth quarter that year as well. And it was like, okay, I did remember that correctly. Obviously, he goes on and wins a Super Bowl with Tampa Bay. But I liked his demeanor. There's a part of me that thinks that maybe if he would have come into that 1998 NFC Championship game, the Vikings might have gone to the Super Bowl. I have it on videotape. I rewatch it every now and then just for little clues. And you can just sense the tension there. And I think he might have been able to cut through that. But Johnson definitely to me is one of the most underrated quarterbacks, and a guy that I just, kind of wanted to check the reality against what my impression was of him. So, how about you? What? Well,
I was going to say Brad Johnson because he was he was like a 9th round pick or something, which doesn't even exist anymore. And he had a couple of years where he kind of developed, and then he became the funny thing about Brad Johnson. And if you follow him on social media, he does like trick shots with basketball. He was a basketball player at Florida State. That was what he really was. And then came into football a little bit later and becomes a draft pick and develops over a couple of years, which we just don't really see this type of thing in the NFL anymore. And he was not mobile in the way that he was fast, but he thought he was. I think he had a basketball players, I'm a playmaker, point guard mindset. And the number of times where there's pressure and Brad Johnson is somehow moving his giant body, like hoofing around people or catching his own pass and running it for a touchdown. He would do these subtle athletic things. And I felt like he was the ultimate game manager in a positive way too. Like he was a playmaker, but also didn't have a lot of mistakes, kept the train on the track, was a really good leader, locked into the offense. And of course, he ends up winning with Tampa Bay in part because of that, because he really just managed the game super well. Washington, when he went there, won. And then I think they didn't win 10 games for who knows how many more years after Brad Johnson was there. I always enjoyed him. I've also interviewed him a couple times, and he's a great dude. The other one to me, while Culpepper was peak of me starting to learn really about football and fully understand it. And I know that there will be people, when you're like, the fans of a team can be so ultra critical because they want a championship and it hasn't happened. But from a person who was not here watching Culpepper, like, what a treat if Dick Stockton and Matt Millen were calling a game with Culpepper throwing it to the roof and having it drop in out of the sky into Randy Moss's hands. That was some of the most fun stuff. That 04 season is one of the great seasons of all time. And it's not even one of Randy Moss's best seasons, which makes that even crazier. And the other one to me is Wade Wilson, because Wade Wilson did not care. He was going to come in and he was going to fire that ball down the field to Anthony Carter. And whatever happened after that happened. He was not going to play safe. He wasn't going to check down. He was just going to come in and let it rip. And the guy averaged like 8.5 yards an attempt when he was a Viking quarterback. I think, a fun approach to playing the position at that time. And that game against San Francisco for Wade Wilson will always go down in history as one of the great playoff upsets, beating that team, and then the way that he played in that game. So there's a lot. And then, but the number one to me though, number one is Jeff George, because that run in 1999 is so freaking entertaining. Jeff George is firing it left and right. The ball is traveling so fast, the cameras cannot keep up with it. Jeff George is just balling out. It looked like sometimes it looked like he didn't even know the play, and he just dropped back and was like, "Where's Randy? I'm just going to throw it to him." He was just the ultimate gunslinger, and I know his reputation, the rest of his career wasn't great, but seeing that arm talent, that attitude to playing quarterback, that's what you go in the backyard with your buddies and just throw it up to your friends. Like, that's how Jeff George played quarterback. He's probably the one that gets referenced on this show more than any other because of how much I enjoy. And when I go, because I do this all the time, I go watch old games on YouTube. I type in 99 Vikings probably more than any other season on YouTube to go back and watch.
Yeah, I certainly remember it well too. I mean, that was pretty incredible. Those first couple of games after he replaced Cunningham, thinking, oh wow, they might do it now. They might do it now. So, I agree. He was a blast to watch. Just when you were talking about Wilson, one of the things when I was researching this book, just really finding some bizarre stat lines. But there was a game in '87 against the Raiders. Wilson replaced Kramer at halftime. He threw 2 passes the entire second half, both for touchdowns, and the Vikings won like 30-21. It wasn't even a low-scoring game. That would never happen now, unless it was a driving rainstorm or snowstorm or something. But this was at the Metrodome. That was one of the fun parts too, is just going back and some of the things that, maybe I saw at the time, but just didn't register. But yeah, I was a big Wade Wilson fan too. You mentioned Culpepper. That was a phenomenal run when he was at his best. And I really thought at one time in my life, that, he would go down in history as the greatest Vikings quarterback because, after that 04 season, the numbers that he put up, it just seemed like sky's the limit. So, yeah, I know. I get very optimistic, but I have to. Ever since I was a little kid, I've been waiting. I was at the tail end of those 4 Super Bowls, so every new era, I have to be convinced that, yep, this is going to be it. So that's the stance I'm taking now.
Well, it comes along with the territory. You wouldn't be here if you gave up easy. Chad Israelson, historian, also the author of Kings of the North, and keep an eye out for your book on Vikings quarterback history, which is going to come out later in the fall, in September, toward the beginning of the season. So I'm excited about that. Hopefully I can grab myself a copy. And make sure you check out Kings of the North, though. Really, really fun book to go through. So Chad, great perspective on Jim Marshall and the quarterbacks. I'm really glad we could connect. Thanks again for coming on the show, man.
Thank you very much for having me.